Good evening. Welcome, everybody. I know we are kind of holding you between drinks, so thanks so much for joining. Very excited to be talking to you today about AWS cloud-based risk management solutions that we have to serve our financial services customers. And so just in terms of the format, I'm going to be talking for about 15 minutes, talking about trends in the industry, what we are seeing. And then we'll be joined by our very illustrious panel for the remainder of the conversation. So we have senior executives from GFT, Accenture, Murex, and IHS Markit, and my colleague Sid Nangia would be leading that particular panel. So that's going to be how we are going to go about the next hour. Let's make sure this works. Great. As we all know, the financial services industry today has fundamentally changed post the credit crisis. A study by Boston Consulting Group says that the number of regulatory changes that have come in place since 2011, it's increased by 3 times just in the last 6 years, to the extent that there are about 200 revisions from a regulatory perspective that some of the global banks are tracking right now. If you look at the number of regulatory bodies across the globe that banks have to adhere to, you have the SEC, the CFTC, the Fed, FDIC, the FinCEN, and that's just talking about the US. And then you have EMEA, where you have the Bank of England, you have the PRA, the FCA, you have different regulatory bodies. And then if you take it to the APAC, every country has their own regulatory bodies that they have to adhere to. So it's a lot. Talking about security, 77%, so in a study, 77% of the CEOs that were surveyed, they said that our risk management capabilities are falling behind. And 2/3 of them actually felt that their security risk has gone up in the last few years. So combine that with the onerous reporting requirements, the difficulties that firms have in hiring and retaining the talent that they need to keep up with the demands that they have. This is I find this really interesting. But Deloitte Consulting published a report citing that 97% of the firms they surveyed have reported increased regulator intervention. And enforcements have gone up. So in the last 5 years, they've gone up by about 20%. But $321 billion, that's the amount of fines that have been levied on the industry. So that's when it really gets real, right? Everybody can talk about, yes, the pressure is increasing, and it's getting tough. But when you have the regulators coming in and enforcing fines to the extent that they have, that's when you really start facing the pressure, the burden. And to add to that, we all know that risk management workloads are very compute intensive. So if you look at different areas from market risk to credit risk to even taking around things around regulatory reporting and compliance, the very heavy compute workloads. Look at VAR calculations, companies that have to do it now on an intraday basis. Look at measures around intraday consumer credit exposure and reporting, portfolio modeling, pricing. Look at CVA calculations that require billions of simulations that firms have to do in order to report risk to the regulators. So all of this presents a very big data, heavy compute problem, and then you put that on existing infrastructure, and it just starts crumbling over there. So it's very hard to procure. Companies talk about 12 to 16 weeks on an average, sometimes even 6 months, that they have to take to procure the hardware, to run their calculations. Once you procure the hardware, you have fixed capacity, so it's not something that you can scale up or down really quickly. You have limitations in terms of hardware and then the configurations that you have. If you look at AWS, we have just from a compute instance type, you have 11 different types of compute instances. And if you buy if you buy standard hardware, you are limited in terms of what configurations you have. The other thing is flexibility. Flexibility to respond to the different regulatory environment, the changes. So now you have MiFID II in the EMEA. You have FRTB that is going to be affecting customers across the globe. And then you need flexibility to run and test different models. So as you're doing your model testing, validation, all the different permutations and simulations, you just need flexibility in order to run that from an infrastructure perspective. The good news, that said, is that things are changing. So today, we have financial services customers across the globe that are experimenting, that are doing things, that are moving to the cloud and actually transforming their organizations. And this is companies across banking, capital markets, and insurance, all large enterprises and also smaller ones that are moving to AWS to drive agility, to drive down costs, and improve time to market. And this is only a small snapshot of companies that we can publicly talk about. There are many more that you're probably familiar with, probably don't. But when our customers talk about moving their risk workloads to AWS, they typically have two options. Option one, they can take our 90-plus services and build whatever they want. They can build an anti-money laundering application or a model risk validation application. But our customers are also saying that AWS, can you provide us turnkey solutions, whether it's a managed service or a hosted service or a SaaS offering that we can take on and just deploy on the AWS infrastructure? So responding to that, last month, we had announced the AWS Cloud Solutions for Governance, Risk, and Compliance. Governance that allows you to respond to the different controls that you need in order to look at the different regulations. Risk, looking at internal risk calculations, market risk, credit risk, the different calculations. And then the last piece, compliance, which deals with regulatory reporting and those areas. So we launched with eight solutions, and this spans across different areas and some of the marquee firms in the industry. But Accenture that has a risk grid solution on the AWS cloud. NICE Actimize that have a nice anti-money laundering and anti-bribery solution that is available to the customers. IHS Markit, which is with a very broad portfolio, but primarily centered around financial risk analytics. FICO, they have a solution around predictive analytics with their Express Optimization solution. GFT, that have launched a solution to help with regulatory reporting, also looking at CAT and some of the areas there. Domino Data Lab around model risk management. Cloud Technology Partners, they have a solution to help with compliance around the different industry regulations, looks at the controls that are there on your environment and how they map against the different regulatory bodies. And then Pindrop, that have a call center authentication solution. So these are 8 that we launched last month. Over time, expect this ecosystem to grow. And we look at your feedback to see which solutions to incorporate and how to grow this. But when companies are moving to AWS, they primarily move for 4 reasons. And you're at reInvent, so you know what these reasons are. But it's about, how do I get to the market faster? How do I drive agility? How do I not have to wait for infrastructure and have to spin up things, in order to run my risk workloads? It's about scalability, not being tied to a fixed capacity and then being limited to that. But as your calculations increase, if you're running CCAR calculations that are probably, you don't need that capacity all the time, then you can you can use it when you need to, and then get shut it down when you don't have to. Security, and this is the whole platform concept. But AWS, since in the last 11 years of our history, we have had 3,000 new features and functionality that we have introduced in the market. A lot of them focused around the security. Time and again, when our financial services customers start working with AWS, they realize they're able to achieve better security and able to attain better compliance than they can do when they're running workloads on-prem. And finally, it's about lowering your total cost of ownership. With AWS, you only pay for what you use, and you turn OpEx into variable expense. And because of our economies of scale, we're able to offer it at a much lower cost than what you can do internally. reinvent, so you guys already know that. So I'm going to close it by talking about a couple of customer examples and take you through that before we get into the panel discussion. But here are some examples of our customers who are using AWS to transform their risk management organization. So Mapfre, it's a leading insurance company in Spain and a non-life insurance company in Latin America. They're doing monthly solvency checks on AWS. And they're actually saving about 820,000 euros over a 3-year time frame as they're doing that. FraudNet. So they are an online payment crowdsourced anti-money laundering platform. They're collecting data from thousands of merchants in real time, aggregating it, and then looking at fraud patterns to report on that. Fraud.net leveraged multiple services, including AWS's machine learning services, to develop a platform that allows their developers to offer models as an API. And they're able to now deliver this in a response time of under 200 milliseconds, and all leveraging AWS services. Talking about Bank Inter, which is a bank in Spain. It's a joint venture between Banco Santander and Bank of America. Bank Inter is running 5 million credit risk simulations to evaluate the financial health of their customers. And they took a process which was taking them 23 hours down to 20 minutes. So incredible, again, scalable compute that has allowed them to deliver that saving. And the last example that I have is OnBen Field, which is a reinsurer division of Aon PLC, and it's a reinsurer. OnBen Field is using AWS to run its actuarial models for about 5 million policyholders. And they've been able to drive down that process that took them 10 days down to 10 minutes. So I'm going to close by asking everybody a question as you kind of think about this as you kind of end this conference, heading back home. But if you had unlimited compute, what risk management problem would you solve for the financial services industry? And I'll leave you at that. So I'll invite our panelists to the stage. Sid, if you can, and I'll invite Sid Nangia, our consulting partner leader for financial services, to introduce the panelists and go from there. Thank you.
Can you guys hear me? Good? Awesome. Thank you so much, Nitin. Just to introduce myself, I'm Sid Nangia. I'm part of the financial services vertical team at AWS. I'm responsible for solution strategy with our partners. So we have a great panel here this afternoon. So Nitin talked about how the regulatory landscape is so complex. Regulatory complexities are rising. So we have new regulations getting released every year. We have CAT coming next year. We have MiFID II in Europe. Because of that, if you look at that, overall, our customers, for them, the building and managing the governance, risk, and compliance systems is very tough. So with our partners, we are now building the Regtech solutions on AWS. And with that, I'm going to start our panel. So I would like our panelists to introduce ourselves. Antoine, please.
My name is Antoine Mourad. I work for Mirex. I'm in charge of strategic alliances and cloud strategy. Mirex is a provider of trading and risk management solutions for the financial industry, both sell side and buy side. And in terms of our involvement with public cloud, we're focusing at the moment on enabling our clients to move their existing Mirex deployments into the public cloud for various use cases ranging from test and dev to full production, or in some cases, hybrid deployments.
Graham.
Thanks, Ed. Nice to be with you here this afternoon. Yes, I'm Graham Hughes, one of our lead architects in financial services. My own focus is on capital markets, so really global investment banks, as well as asset and wealth management clients. And we've seen in the last 2 years really a step change. And so it's all about design and then execution of cloud journeys as well.
Andrew?
Hi, my name is Andrew Eisen from IHS Markit. We're a global information powerhouse that provides unique data sets, research, software, and services across a dozen or so verticals with a very strong footprint in financial services. My role with them is really, one, leading our cloud strategy and our migration into a cloud-first operating model. I also run our enterprise data management platform and our hosted and managed services for our clients, helping them move software assets to the cloud.
Ami?
Hi, I'm Ami Grull. I'm the head of capital market strategy at GFT. GFT are a financial services engineering firm. So we really focus just on financial services. We work really with both the buy side and the sell side, helping them move applications to public cloud as well as hybrid cloud. And really we're focused on the engineering aspects of that. So the actual execution part of how do you get from non-cloud native applications to fully cloud native, or translation of those apps over into cloud.
Thank you, Ami. So I prepared a set of questions, but we're going to have this discussion free-flowing. In case you have any questions, you can ask at the end of the discussion. So we're going to start with our first topic, which is how our financial services companies are using the public cloud and what business values, they are getting out of it. So Antoine, I'm going to start with you. At Murex, you have a defined strategy for the public cloud. So what was the main business driver for that strategy? And can you also talk about what are you hearing from your customers on running Murex solution suite on public cloud?
Okay. Fundamentally, we think that banks should not be and don't want to be in the business of building and operating data centers. They do it out of necessity. If they're given a choice to move safely into the public cloud, we think that all of them will want to do it. So what's limiting them is the concern about security, compliance, regulation, etc. But as these things get worked out, people will move, and with getting to a tipping point where we see more and more of our clients wanting to make that step. And we see three types of drivers or value sources from that move. There are some people that want to move completely and want to get rid of their own data centers. And so they're ready to put their production environments into the cloud. And we see that in various jurisdictions. It's not specific to, sometimes we have several clients that are under the same regulation, but one of them would decide that they can do this step, and another one maybe will not be ready to do it. The other major driver that we see is agility. Banks want to be able to deliver projects faster, and they see cloud as a way to implement agility and adopt DevOps processes and so on. And that's the whole test and dev type processes that they would like to move to cloud. And finally, we have the banks that are a bit more conservative, that feel that the systems of record need to stay on premise, but they would like to utilize cloud for compute tasks. Keep the data private, and that's also another big driver.
Great. So I'm going to go over to you, Andrew. At IHS Markit, you have multiple product suites running on AWS, on a public cloud. So what difference do you see about your product suite running on on-prem versus on a public cloud?
I'd say the first thing we've seen with the adoption of the public cloud is the ability to get a working solution up faster and to bring that agile deployment methodology in a lot of the typical implementations we do with our clients, whether it's the services or our software applications. We can be much more iterative. Time to market is quicker. What we've also found is because we've used a lot of the automation and DevOps capabilities that the team has standardized as part of our software businesses, we're able to get through the certifications, the audits, the compliance reviews much quicker. And where we find the clients are selecting the cloud or the public cloud as an operating model is when they're looking through their budget cycles or their hardware refresh cycles, and they've decided to allocate that capital to other projects that absolutely have to be kept on-prem or feel that way. So there's still a holdout or a portion of the industry or a portion of the application lifecycle where the cloud just isn't mature enough to be the primary place to run in. And you look at some of the challenges facing the core infrastructure providers for processing of real-time processing of transactions, where there are very specific SLAs on resiliency and latency. And we're not quite there, but when you look at the operational, I'll take the data management example for EDM, as an operational platform to optimize data, cleanse data, and distribute it across an organization, the cloud provides an optimal operating model for that.
That's a good point. So Graham, you know, as Accenture, you work with multiple customers across financial services, right? And you are seen as a trusted advisor to our customers. So how your financial services customers are using public cloud? What do you see in the market?
So I think a lot of our customers started using SaaS-based solutions probably 5-6 years ago for things like CRM and marketing, and I think that became a catalyst to start looking at, you know, the IaaS and PaaS cases that we see today. So, you know, it's relatively immature, I think, is a fair comment, certainly for the larger banks. But I think, as Antoine mentioned, we are now at a tipping point. We see that, you know, every financial services organization, from the tier 1 globals through to the regional banks, the asset and wealth managers, and insurance companies, now have all got some sort of cloud strategy, and quite a lot of them are along the lines of executing in them. And AWS is certainly front and center of that. We also see, from a use case perspective, you know, this is where is how can we leverage the likes of Amazon to provide value back to the business. And, you know, we've got a solution for risk grid, certainly, because that's where banks have got a large amount of compute, and also it's highly elastic in terms of use case. And then secondly, for things like regulatory reporting that you referenced, again, is something that's it's not business differentiating, it's something that's mandatory, and again, a great opportunity to leverage public cloud.
Great. So I'm going to ask you a follow-on question, Ami. You know, with GFT, you work with so many of financial services customers, right? You have helped them define their cloud strategy, helped them move to the public cloud. What do you think is the most important benefit of public cloud for financial services customers?
So, I mean, there's obviously an easy answer to that, which is cost. Everybody will say cost. And, you know, if I look at our clients and I look at the impact of cost to them, it's been significant. You know, if I think of a risk calculation, we moved to cloud for a client, we saw a shift of about 4x, which is pretty significant. Yeah. But what was really, really far more interesting in that particular use case was that the time for that risk calculation went from 4 minutes to 10 seconds, right? And a lot of that was around the ability to use different technology and use technology which was just very innovative for them, very different for them. And so the actual ability to innovate using more bleeding edge technology and actually integrate within a different development cycle for them is much, much bigger. So I think cost is the almost the carrot. But actually, there's a whole variety of things that come after you've gotten past that initial migration. And as you start to get into having more cloud-native applications, there's a whole plethora of different avenues and paths you can take in architecting them, which really allow you to do some really, really very innovative things that can change both your operating model, but also, you know, as I mentioned, your elasticity, but also your actual just general operating model around the business, because you can suddenly do things that you just couldn't do before. And I think that's really the biggest driver here. which I think the banks are starting to see.
Yeah.
I think the asset managers have seen it a while ago, and they've moved it a little bit faster. And so, if I look at the dichotomy there, for once, the asset management community is further ahead in this than the investment banks are, and that's going to change the dynamic a bit.
No, that's a great point. What we have seen is the most important point we have seen with our financial services customer is the pace of innovation, right? The way they can innovate, the way they can release products to the market is amazing using the public cloud.
Well, just to build on that, we had a very successful implementation of a risk grid where the conversation shifted from meeting a 7-hour or 8-hour batch SLA to the permutations of additional calculations, risk scenarios, models, sensitivities that could be run, because suddenly the options available to the risk team could be proactive. So now they could say, oh, we have this extra capacity. Maybe we could look at these sensitivities on top of it, bootstrap it, run some of this distribute it to this group in this region, and then use this extra capacity that we never had before to run some additional permutations and models, which really helped them. Right? So it's more than just get it there faster, cheaper. It's now I can ask questions that I didn't have the capital, the compute, or even the know-how how to ask. And between all the tools that are brought to market, you can start to do much more complicated analysis.
Yeah, that's a good point. If you look at 5 years back or 10 years back, how expensive was compute and storage, right? With the public cloud, it's become so easier for a data scientist or for your statisticians to do any innovation, right? To run any of the models. So I'm going to talk about, the next topic, which is cloud for risk management and regulatory reporting. So we have seen that financial risk management is largely the data and analytical business, which relies heavily on our compute, right? You have to do CCAR calculations, you have to do stress testing. There are so many requirements from Basel, from central banks, from FINRA. There's so much going on. Sometimes, to run those calculations, there is so much compute you need, and all these financial services companies spend like tens and millions of dollars on that. So, Graham, I've got a question for you. We have been working with you to put up a risk grid solution, which we just released last month, which Nitin was talking about. Can you talk about how the risk management and different regulations, FRTB, CCAR, can be benefited from the public cloud?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Sid. I think the first thing that you mentioned was, there's just continues to be more and more demand for compute.
Yeah.
A lot of that is regulatory driven. You've mentioned the fact, FRTB and banks are talking about when their internal models are ready, they'll probably need new data centers to be able to support that. So, first and foremost, that is that's a burning platform. But also the elastic requirements that are required for a risk grid. Certainly, a public cloud is very much a model that is very attractive, just given the fact that the demand may not be flat. So I think that's a consistent trend. Now, the other thing is that there's been a lot of intellectual capital that's been put into those calculations that exist today for market and credit risk, and so there's going to be some degree of re-engineering to make use of an elastic framework. So that is an effort that needs to be undertaken to really reap the benefit. So it's a double-edged sword in some ways.
Yeah, I think the most important thing is when we talk to our customers or partners, they say, cloud is not about infrastructure anymore; it's platform. If you look at AWS, we have 90 plus services, right? Any customers can come if they want to use AI, ML, if they wanted to use DevOps, they can just use those services from a platform and build the systems around it. I think that's the most important thing. So talking about regulatory reporting, right? If you look at the regulatory reporting landscape, I was talking about CAT, right? And MiFID II in Europe. So financial services companies are spending millions of dollars, right, to build applications and infrastructure to support regulatory reporting. Now, in fact, you must have heard about FINRA, right? FINRA is using AWS for marketing surveillance. So each night, FINRA loads approximately 35 billion rows into Amazon S3 and EMR to monitor trading activity on exchanges. So, which is, the regulators are using AWS. So to that point, Ami, I have a question. You have built a reg reporting solution on AWS. How do you think that regulatory reporting function can be benefited by implementing on public cloud?
I mean, in many ways, it's kind of the most obvious thing to go after, right? If you look at reg reporting, it's something that nobody wins a medal for being best at it, right? It's something everybody has to do and has to be consistent with. And it's a burden to every organization that has to do it. Obviously, they need to because they want to stay in business. But if you look at the implementations, and we've had at GFT, we've had the chance to look at the implementations of reg reporting solutions across many different banks. Surprisingly, they all look the same. They all tend to have a very similar architecture. They happen to have a very similar data transformation layer, similar storage layer. And we looked at all of these different things and said, wait a minute, this is an obvious case where building something as a central SaaS-based utility is just going to be naturally easier. If you look at the amount of time and money that's spent doing the business analysis about interpretation of rules and regulation and actually turning those into sets of usable logic and code, it's repeated effectively 50 times at every organization, or amongst all the organizations in the capital markets industry. So naturally, when we looked at something like CAT, or even if I say MiFID 2, or let's say SFTR in Europe, there's a whole variety of regulations that are coming in that are all transaction-based, that effectively have the same functional architecture, very similar technical architectures, and most of the same non-functional problems. So that was, there's an obvious fix when you see something that's similar. For us, we see that as a very obvious thing to put onto cloud and to put centrally onto cloud. If I look at the benefit that you start seeing there is everybody will then start to have the similar interpretation of a regulation, which ultimately means you get a herd mentality, which should be good, hopefully. May not have worked so well previously, but we believe that at least with regulation, if the regulators all agree on that interpretation of the reg, that's also a good thing, right? If the regulator like a FINRA, even in Europe, you see Bank of England pushing people to cloud as well. So there's the regulators are starting to get behind this thing. I think of CAT as a great example. I've got clients who will say, well, I don't want to move my orders to cloud for CAT. So, well, it doesn't matter if you don't. FINRA are going to anyway. So you can have a choice here. You can either get the benefit of using cloud, which your regulator is going to use, or you can ignore it and close your eyes.
Yeah. So let me ask you one more question on that. From your solution perspective, what do you think is going to be the time frame, right? If you have to implement the solution, how much time would our customers save, implementing those solutions versus like on-prem and cloud?
So, I mean, for CAT specifically, there's a slightly different problem in terms of the actual requirements have only just recently come out. Yeah. So, but if I think of a standard, typical implementation of a reg reporting platform, think back to Dodd-Frank, right? So Dodd-Frank took about 1.5 years for most banks to implement. Yeah. And in that process, they went through the case of building a new data warehouse, building a new ETL layer, building a new reporting layer, setting up ops teams to do all this great stuff. And then there's like 50 million Excel sheets that sit off the back of this thing. All of that stuff has, apart from the Excel bit, has mostly been done. And in fact, the Excel bit's been replaced by Kibana in our case, because, hey, it's, you click a button, it's done. But all of those kind of core components, all the reference parts of it have been done by us. So now it's just a case of actually making sure that the data architecture that our clients are using, which in some cases, if I look at CAT, it's fixed, right? And it should be fixed. Now, okay, there's a whole variety of different variations within fix, but the ability to be able to take those standard fixed models and plug them straight into this is pretty quick. So you're looking at something like a 6-week turnaround to get somebody up and running on something like a CAT transaction reporting solution. It will vary more on things like MiFID 2, where there's not as much standard, but even if you look at the derivatives type transaction reporting requirements, they're typically using things like FPML. And every bank has taken their own version of FPML and turned it into whatever version, something ML, surprisingly. But even then, they're still very much similar to FPML. So between FPML and Fix, you've actually got some pretty standard transaction layers as well, or messaging layers. You can plug those in. There's some work to be done, but it's not so much. It's far quicker time to market than would have been traditional.
That's great. So Antoine, on this topic, what do you think is the most important value of running risk management system on the public cloud?
Risk management workloads lend themselves very well to the cloud model for a variety of reasons. I mean, one, as you mentioned, is that there's, with the new regulation coming on board, both in terms of market risk as well as in credit risk, there's a 100-fold increase in the need for compute power, and some of these computations need to be done in real time. For some of that, you need some type of hardware acceleration, like GPUs or for the compute side, and also for the data. Also, there's large amounts of data that get generated in that process and need to be shared between different nodes and so on. So you need sometimes high-speed networks or high-speed I/O to deliver this type of computation in real time. Managing that kind of infrastructure on premise is very heavy and very costly. And all of this can be done in the cloud. And also, what we see, both in terms of intraday as well as end of day, we see use cases where the cloud can be leveraged to reduce cost dramatically. Intraday, these workloads tend to be very bursty. So there's an opportunity there for people to use cloud to scale up for these periods of the day where they need extra capacity. So that way they can size their on-premise infrastructure for the average, and then for peaks they can go to cloud. So that's a very effective use case that we see. And then at the end of the day, typically you have these large batches that have to be run that are more regulatory in nature, and typically they start at the closing of the business day and they last for a number of hours. Provisioning infrastructure for that on-premise means you have to pay for the infrastructure all the time. You're using it, a few hours on business days only. So for that reason as well, the cloud model, the metered model, is very beneficial for these.
So let's talk about a few of the use cases and what business impact cloud is delivering to our customers. And I'm going to talk to you, Andrew, about that. And I know you have some of the solutions running already on AWS, right, with some customers. So can you give an example of one of your customers in which, which they delivered value by running your solution suite on AWS?
Absolutely. Actually, a couple good ones come to mind, but I'll start with the financial risk analytics, because that's sort of the core of the conversation. We recently worked with, I did a joint presentation at a recent risk conference with SMBC Capital Markets to talk about how we took their risk grid for CVA. We call it XVA now because we're running out of acronyms. So X could be any letter for whatever models you need to apply. I think we were FVA, CVA, so we just call it XVA. And essentially we looked at their deployment plan, their project plan, their procurement plan, and they were in the midst of implementing our software, and we approached them, we said, to hit your objectives, we have to iterate faster. So how about we lift this out of your on-prem data centers and we build it in the cloud, and then just make sure that you have the time to market and you can meet your business SLAs. And I'd say the most interesting part of that conversation wasn't about grid computing, and it wasn't about elasticity, and it wasn't about scale. It was about changing the conversation for a risk implementation to be solely based on SLAs and business objectives, and not talk about CPUs, GPUs, gigs of RAM, terabytes of data. We completely eliminated that for the conversation and said, okay, what sensitivities do you need to run, by when, where do you need the results shipped to, by when, what's your exception processing windows, and you had the client change their entire procurement process because they weren't used to saying, okay, we need 640 cores or we need 1,200 cores, because that's the way the model has always worked. So in disrupting the model, you have a whole different conversation with the client. So I'd say that was the most interesting, I'll call it risk implementation. We've also had a lot of success supporting investor reporting, MiFID, FRTB. We've put together some utility applications where it was really the combination of understanding the data assets as well. Again, when you separate the infrastructure, you can spend less time talking about compute and more about, do we have the right data? Do we have the right location? Are we applying the right governance through the process to make sure that what we're giving to the regulators or what we're giving to our obligations is right, as opposed to really worrying about lining up all the pieces, the network, the infrastructure, and those types of pieces. So again, we've been very successful in MiFID II, FRTB, some of our risk factor utility work, where we've kind of changed the dialogue to about business-oriented delivery as opposed to a very heavy technical conversation.
I know you started this journey with us 3 years back. Probably you were one of the first few partners to have your solutions running on AWS. And what were the challenges which you faced in your customers' organization? And can you talk about your most famous statement on the lawyers, please?
Oh, so first of all, we're probably single-handedly responsible for more gray hair of the Amazon Financial Services Partner Group and the financial services sales and account teams. But it's been a great journey. There's members in the audience tonight who were with me on that first day where we got funding with $10,000 on a credit card to build a whole cloud-first strategy and business line. And we've come pretty far from there. And I'd say the reference you're making about my famous comment was, we were at this risk conference and we were talking about the biggest challenge. And the question from the audience was, well, if the cloud is so great, why isn't everybody doing everything on the cloud today? And without the filter, I responded, well, that's because lawyers suck. And how I'm supposed to have responded to that comment was, well, because the systems and the processes and the governance that's in place today isn't always ready. The people, the processes, the forms, the who clicks what buttons and says it to who, they don't actually have the ability to change or adapt to this new model. So you spend a lot of time, I want to say, educating, working through the process, going high to executive level people who get the joke and help change the organization from a top-down level so that they can be more flexible and adapt to the changing marketplace as we have.
No, that's a great point. What we have seen is that, if you go and talk to the procurement, right, if you go and present SOW, first of all, they will give you so much grief and they will say, oh, we're going to put in our system, it's going to take 6 months to do it. I think when we start talking about cloud with our customers, the more important thing is how to change that culture at customers' organization, because there's so much bureaucracy in financial services organization. So, but we are crossing that hump and we are getting there. So, Ami, I'm going to ask you, you have built this awesome solution on AWS, reg reporting, right? Can you talk about that, how it's going to help meeting their regulatory requirements quickly, specifically, not even on CAD, but other regulatory reporting?
Yeah, so I mean, if I think about what we've built, it's very much effectively a reference architecture with a set of specific pieces within it which are focused on core regs. So if I look at the aspects around how do you handle data lineage and data governance within regulation, right? So one of the product managers for this within GFT is a chap called Paul Burleton. And Paul sits in London. He's our head of reg in London. He's the ex-head of equity operations and prime operations at Barclays. So he's lived this. He lived this for about the last 10 years. So he came and worked for us and said, let's fix this problem, right? And we spoke to a whole variety of folks in the industry, and we looked at this and said, actually, it's always the same thing. This is what people live in Excel in operations. They sit down, they look at, every day, they look at a set of transactions. Why didn't these get reported? And we go find out why these didn't get reported. And we go fix each one of these. And we said, why don't we build a user experience around this and actually build this into part of the solution? So now what you've got is a solution that actually you can go into and you can say, okay, these number of transactions were broken. This is why they were broken. These are the data fields that weren't there. These were the same data fields that weren't there yesterday. I fixed it this way yesterday, click a button, it's done.
Yeah.
Now, at some point, you could probably integrate something like machine learning into that. That's obviously some things we'd like to do, but there's a bit of danger to that, obviously, in that you've got to be able to prove to regulators why you did something. But at least you've suddenly got a solution which is starting to automate things, or at least make things a lot easier from an operational and workflow perspective. Then if you start pushing that forward to just say, that's one regulation. If you were then to expand that out and say, let's look at MiFID 2 as well. So MiFID 2 has become a challenge because of the scale and speed that people need to implement it. And so again, you've suddenly got I'm going to say, sticky tape, putting things together in the back end of most organizations to make the actual data flow work. If you were to have something which actually at the front end of that was looking at where the problems were, and at some point the banks can then actually spend the money to fix the back end, which is pretty much what happened with BSBUS209, and it's still happening with BSBUS209, you suddenly have a point where you can actually start fixing those things, granted after you've implemented the reg, but at least it's something that's valuable even if you've implemented that reg already. So it's not just something that's valuable because you've got a reg that's coming in the future like CAT, but it's something that can help you start resolving your legacy debt within your organization, both data debt and technical debt. And then finally, if you think about the ability to be able to take that data in real time and reconstruct your trade and order book, that's something which many banks really struggle to do across all asset classes.
Yeah.
And suddenly you can now do that pretty much at a click of a button. As long as you've got that data streaming in, obviously that's a big if. But once you have that, you've got the ability to add things like Elasticsearch, you've got the ability to add DynamoDB into this mix, and a whole variety of things like Kibana, tools that you just didn't have access to before that can do some very, very different things.
Right.
And all of those are out there in the Amazon universe that we've integrated to some degree, but the functional architecture is there and set up in a way that you can plug in the bits that you want to expand it out in the way that you want to do extra things. So really, I look at it as a solution that is valuable not just to new regulation, but existing regulation that's been implemented.
I think that's a good point. And at AWS, right, we always talk about customer obsession, right? From the solutions perspective, when we will go and implement the solutions at our customers, we'll get feedback. We'll keep on expanding, improving our solutions so that, we can take it forward. So, Antoine, I'm going to ask you, at Murex, how do you see the market evolving between the SaaS solution and, bring your own license or running those solutions on-prem?
Today, in regards to the model in terms of using the cloud, we come from a 30 years of providing solutions on premise. So we have a large installed base, some of them with a large footprint of Murex deployments on premise. So the focus for us, the urgency anyway, is to enable those clients to migrate to public cloud. So we see a lot of bring your own license for the next 3 years. That would be, the focus of use of public cloud in our client base. We do have a SaaS business that we are planning to migrate to public cloud, and we see that growing over time. And we see a number of other scenarios that will be enabled by cloud, where our clients or our partners will use our platform to deliver the services, whether it is in an asset servicing context, where banks provide services to other financial institutions, or our integrated partners such as Accenture that provide services around our application, who might look to provide more of these services in the cloud.
Great. So I'm going to move to the next topic, which is, everyone talks about it, which is security and compliance. You talk to any of the financial services customer, the first thing which they will talk about is security. But it's changing now. So Graham, you again work with so many financial services customers, right? So what do you think that, when you're working with your customers, how do you advise your customers around security, about running their key systems into the public cloud? How do you do that? How do you convince them?
So yeah, it's a very topical subject, and I think it's where every financial services organization starts with just trying to get their head around what the impact is if surely public means unsecure, and really a lot of it comes down to the fact that in most on-premise solutions, there's not a lot of security or controls that exist on-premise, i.e. it's a trusted network. You've got database links all over the place. You've got flat files. You've got unencrypted connections. So the first challenge to move out is obviously around the security aspect. But before you even get there, there's a lot of concern around the regulatory landscape. And that again is very piecemeal, because you've got a situation, as you discussed, where the likes of FINRA in the US are very progressive in terms of what they're pushing out there. Whereas you've got some of the, I think it was Nitin referred to it, the Asian regulators just still haven't really got their head around what public cloud means yet. And so that's the first thing, is to to understand what your own regulatory landscape is and how that affects your own legal entity structure. Then when you get on to the actual getting to cloud, I think as we recommend, there's a number of things that you need to do, and the first thing is really around making sure you've got actual access to cloud and you're using the most of your security groups and your IAM. Then actually how you apply your policies and how you enforce the policies that you've got on cloud. And then the other big areas are around encryption, both server-side and client-side encryption. And again, there's there's a lot of reluctance to fully embrace some of the Amazon services that such as your cloud HSMs. And so again, we quite often see that using Amazon KMS with a bring your own key is very much a model that most large financial services organizations are become comfortable with. But I think over time you'll start to see probably more progressive use of HSMs, etc., as well. So I think it's also very much an industry that works on precedence. So I think the more that we hear the stories of IHS Markit being out there and FINRA being out there and
nobody
the
wants
others,
to be the first, right?
no, exactly. No one wants to be the first. And once you show there's others have done it, then very much it gathers impetus. And I think that's certainly a key trend at the moment.
Yeah, definitely. That's what we have seen. Any of the major banks on Wall Street, does the public announcement, you will see everyone kind of following it.
Exactly.
And that's what's going to happen. So I know we have only like 9 minutes left. So I'm going to talk to you, Andrew, right? You have been working with us for the last 3 years, right? And as you know that we always believe in getting feedback from our customers, and we were talking about it, before this session. So what do you think that what we could do better, when we are helping our customers in their governance, risk, and compliance obligations? And we are releasing so many services on blockchain, AI, and ML. So how do you think your product strategy is going to change?
I think there's two pieces. I think, and everyone here can weigh in because we're in the end of the session. I think the first thing I would say is the focus on the customer is phenomenal with AWS. And that's one of the reasons why we've been so supportive of the partnership. And what I think the first thing the partner program could do, or AWS could do as a provider to this space, is start to provide, I'll call them templates or common observations in operating as a core infrastructure provider in an Asian jurisdiction. If everybody in the industry knows that you have to encrypt everything at rest in this particular region, you have to make sure that the data has to reside within the region, and all of these things because obviously you're operating as a financial services infrastructure provider, then the defaults or templates should be there. Oh, you're spinning something up in Singapore. By the way, these 7 things you should know. And that would help save the customer having to interpret it each and every time somebody new has to spin up an instance or subscribe to a service. And I don't know if you guys...
I think I've written the requirements down.
Well, I was going to say that I think you're in danger of putting GFT and Accenture out of business. but actually, in truth, that's advisory work that we have to do up front for free, and as those same common questions. So I think we would all benefit from having those golden rules being freely available
faster,
to all.
Right?
Yeah.
We'd get to the more fun work as opposed to sitting there talking about the same thing over and over again. But if I think of, I look at that document about data standards both in transit and in REST. I've written that document. It's like a 300-page document for every jurisdiction that most organizations work in, right? It's not actually the most complicated thing in the world. It's just really boring.
Incredibly so.
So it's just one of those things which I think it has to get done. I think if an organization like AWS did it, it would make things a lot easier, and it would make things far more standardized.
Or even just provide the base guidelines. Are you sure buttons? I love are you sure buttons. Those are good ways to save clients a lot of risk.
Yeah, no, in fact, we are taking this feedback very seriously, and we are working on some trainings. We are building some documents which will help you to go to Singapore, or go to Turkey, or go to anywhere, and try to expedite the adoption of AWS.
And bear in mind, you've got to keep them up to date.
Yes.
So if you need help with that.
There you go. No, great. So, Antoine, before our discussion, we were talking about, we just released, made some announcements on blockchain. And this is a very interesting topic across financial services. So at Murex, what's your blockchain strategy? And how do you see that your product evolving around that?
Well, blockchain in financial services is moving from the prototype stage to more the mainstream stage, let's say. And we see a number of market infrastructure providers starting to real projects to migrate their core systems, especially in the area of matching and confirmation and settlement to blockchain. And we see ISDA now as well focusing on building a common domain model that would underlie the modeling of smart contracts. There's a lot of developments there, and reconciliations are notoriously known to be the bane of the industry. So this promise of having this distributed ledger that everybody can trust, and a single source of truth for everyone, for trades, for events, is clearly something that is very, very promising. So we will definitely be investing quite a bit in that direction.
Great. And to that point, Graham, when we talk to our financial service customers, everyone is hearing these buzzwords, right? AI, ML, cognitive, what's going on? But what do you think that how the AI, ML will help specifically in the risk management area, as the market is evolving?
Yeah, so we talked a lot this afternoon about risk calculations and transaction reporting, but I mean they don't really add a lot of value back to the business unless you do something with them. So I think the first thing is around in the risk space anyway. Data quality management is certainly one of the banes of operations leads, and they have to, they don't accept the fact that quite a lot of the data they have is incorrect. Machine learning is an absolutely awesome development, just to take a lot of the manual effort out of spotting trends in some of the issues that come from bad data effectively, and then rectifying it too. So that's certainly one thing that will change things for the better. Then AI for sure is making the most of those trends and making sure that they don't happen in the first place. That's just from a data quality, and then once from a risk calculation perspective is being able to sort of go full circle and have a feedback loop to go back into your trading strategies, based on what your actual, counterparty credit risk is, or your sensitivities that you got in the market risk space. Actually doing something with that information that doesn't take you a quarter to go, oh, I now know we've got exposure to XYZ, and actually doing something about it quicker is really the next evolution of what AI can bring. And I would also just like to say that I've been invited to the Partner Day Labs on Thursday to go through Amazon's latest offerings on AI and ML. So thank you, and I'm really excited about going to that actually.
Great. Ami, any inputs from you on AI and ML?
I just echo what Graham was saying. I mean, it's interesting. I think back 5 or 6 years ago, I was sitting on a trading floor with the head of markets for a bank, and he basically said, look, what I really want is a recommendation engine that can actually spew out recommendations to my sales force as to what they should be saying to our to their clients. And we sat down, we looked at it, we scoped it out, and we said, if you actually want to build this is really hard. But if you look at, and back then we went off and did something using a bunch of our stuff and some really interesting things, but ultimately it's for one line of business, very, very small, very discreet. Now if I look at it, what reg reporting has done is actually forced everybody to build massive data warehouses with all their data in. So suddenly you've got this huge chunk of data that you can actually do something with.
Yes.
Right? And okay, it's been a burden to build it, but now you can go off and do something almost like that, automation around, market prediction, market behavior, and obviously some of those things are a little bit dangerous, but actually using them in a way to actually help guide your clients and guide your sales teams is something that I think machine learning is absolutely perfectly suited for. And given that you've now got the big data sets to do your training, which you didn't have before, and obviously the training models and training data sets are critical to making this work. I think that's really, really powerful. So I think that's definitely a direction that many banks are already thinking about.
Andrew, any closing comments on AI/ML or what you guys are doing?
From our perspective, and being a financial services provider, but also a data provider, we're investing heavily in that type of machine learning and AI, but across not just the portfolio risk or the underlying regulatory risk, but layering the other data sets that are suddenly available, whether it's transportation or aerospace and defense or energy data, logistical data, and then tying that to see dynamically how the relationships in, where these ships are in the Atlantic with weather patterns impacts my exposure in a particular region. And you can start thinking it through a security risk perspective, a regional risk perspective. So we're seeing a very exciting opportunity where correlations or relationships between data that we conceptually know exist but never had the opportunity to put together and crunch with the GPUs and the advancements in the standardization or the platforms, creating the platforms that you can put copious amounts of data into the cloud, run copious amounts of compute against that, and have some very smart people ask really smart questions of that data, gets you a phenomenal perspective that no one's really had before. And that's where we're spending a lot of time in our investment across the firm.
Awesome. I think we're almost out of time, so probably we can take one question if anyone has got any question.
So given the tight tie with data and compute and what you referred to earlier as a need to kind of separate out a system of reference from the system of record, given that you have a hybrid deployment where somebody's not closing a data center down, what are the recommendations you're providing to your clients around creation of a data lake either in the cloud or on premise?
So Graham, you want to take it or?
So,
yes.
So I think it's an interesting one, right? And it's a problem that's going to turn up more and more in the migration from hybrid to public, but also the belief that many banks have that many institutions have that they need to have both. And then you add in multiple cloud vendors into that, and it gets even more complicated, right? And I'm not going to mention any names, but obviously, there are other cloud vendors out there other than AWS, unbelievably. But the interconnectivity between those pieces, I mean, from our perspective, we're putting it as a recommendation around secure channels between those connectivity pieces, and making sure that when you're actually putting data in, you've got all the right key management at both ends of it, so that actually your data's coming in and out in a way that, regardless of whether you lose the packets in the middle, you're not actually going to lose any data. I think there are aspects around it in terms of what data do you actually need to have on public cloud. So if I look at some of the jurisdictional stuff around, what can you actually transit to public cloud currently, it starts to get a bit limited if you look at things like, PIP information and all of the client reference stuff. Now, I think that will change with CAP because it has to change with CAP because FINRA are going to have a bunch of client reference data sitting in public cloud. But as that does change, I think you're going to see the ability for certain data which has to have had to have previously sat in hybrid cloud to be able to move to public cloud. And when that does happen, I think you're going to start seeing some of the breakdowns in some of the traditional models around, hey, we just have a pipe between these two things and we move the data in between, to actually we need to have an API sitting between these two pieces. And actually the API becomes excuse me, and the API becomes the more controlled way of doing it. And suddenly you end up in a very serverless model, right? And actually the serverless model becomes way more powerful. Because then you can actually start forgetting about where the data sits altogether and just assume you've got a very discrete service layer with a discrete security interface in front of it. It doesn't matter if it's hybrid cloud or public cloud. You can worry about that later. Now, granted, you lose some of the benefits of having some of the value-add services that you might get from AWS and the special bespoke services you get there, but actually you can still use those behind your API and your service. So that's what I would be doing.
Great, awesome. Thank you, Ami. I think we're almost over, so I really thank you everyone for attending this session, and drinks are waiting for all of us. Thank you so much. Thanks, Sami. Thank you. Antoine. Thanks.
Thank you, Sid.